All right. Good afternoon for those of us on the East Coast. Thanks for joining our webinar today. My name is Natalie Ross. I'm the Vice President for External Relations at the Council on Foundations. And we're really excited to co-host this webinar with our very strong partners at the Foundation Center to talk about a new report we've done together. So I want to introduce you to the speakers on today's webinar, and then we're going to jump right in. But as you hopefully saw on the slides before we got started, please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll try to answer them as we go, but we're also planning to have a good chunk of time available at the end of our conversation for additional questions. So we look forward to this being a conversation with all of you about what you found in our data or what questions you may have about our report. So I'm honored to be joined on the webinar and in authoring this report with two wonderful women from the Foundation Center, Lauren Bradford, their Director of Global Partnerships, and Inga Ingolfsson, the Analyst for Global Partnerships. So the way that we're going to run this webinar is we're going to each take different chunks of the data and walk you through some of our key takeaways from the report and from our analysis, and then we'll be in conversation, answer questions as they go. So with that, I'll hand it over to Inga to get us started.
Thank you, Natalie. What we're doing is essentially looking at the international grant making of U.S. foundations over a 5-year period from 2011 to 2015. And now, why did we choose that time period? Some of you may know that Council and Foundation Center have actually been working together all the way back to 1997 doing these types of analyses. This is the 10th report in our series, and we hadn't done an analysis since 2012 when we looked at data from 2010, so we figured it was about time and that we should do it proper justice and look at this entire period since we last did the analysis and look at some trends over time as well as some overall figures. So what you're seeing here are some top line takeaways from our analysis. So over the 5-year period that we looked at, we identified $35.4 billion in total of international giving. And the way that we're thinking about international giving in this context is not just in terms of cross-border giving. We're thinking about both grants to organizations that are located abroad, but we're also including grants to U.S. organizations, either for a program that's implemented abroad or for a globally focused program. And over the 5-year period, the total dollars for international grants increased by 29%. And in 2015, international giving reached an all-time high of $9.3 billion. And if you look at this dollar trends chart going all the way back to 2002, you can see a dip there after the financial crisis over 2 years. And then in 2011, the longer-term growth trend recovered with some fluctuations in the couple of years after. But really what we're seeing is a long-term trend of growth in international giving.
Great. And before we go on to the next slide, we wanted to do a poll. We're going to do some polling of all of you on the line with us throughout the webinar today so that you can be a part of our conversation. So we're really curious what you think is the percentage of overall grants by U.S. foundations that were for global causes in 2015. So what percentage of the overall grants made by dollar amount were for global causes specifically? So the poll will launch or has launched. So if you want to tell us what you think, then Inga will give us some more detail on what the data shows us. Great, and you can see from the results of the poll that we had a split for most of you thinking it's about 15% or about 30%, and the answer is 30%. So Inga, do you want to walk us through that data?
Sure thing. So if we look at the graph on the next slide, what we're seeing is another long-term trend that's coming out of the data, which is international giving is not only growing in terms of the total dollars awarded, but it's also been growing for a long time as a percentage of the overall giving of U.S. foundations. If we get the next slide. Can we pull up that next slide?
Great. And so if we look at the global giving by foundation type, as you see on this slide, the majority of international grants or grants for international programs are from private foundation, independent foundations specifically, with about almost 90% of the grants. That's really driven by the Gates Foundation, which represented over 56% of all independent foundation dollars during this time period. But we do see about 6% from corporate foundations and almost 3% from community foundations. It's interesting that community foundations, almost half of that international giving is by one institution, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. But overall, we do see a growing trend of community foundations engaging globally. And if you want to know more specifically about community foundations and how they do global grant making, we did co-produce a report last year with the Foundation Center on specifically that, which has a lot more data on which community foundations are giving globally and for what issues. Also for corporate foundations, as I said, they're almost 7%, but it's important to note this is grant making by corporate foundations. So this isn't looking at overall corporate giving, just the grant making by their foundation. Many companies don't have a foundation, and so they do direct giving out of their corporate institution, or they do other types of philanthropy beyond grant making. And so this is just a slice of what corporate philanthropy looks like globally. And of those corporates, it's interesting that the Coca-Cola Foundation, in the report, you can see the top funders by each type. And the Coca-Cola Foundation was the largest corporate donor, nearly double the contributions of the second largest corporate, which is the Citi Foundation, followed by the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. So if we look overall at what the top funders are by grant dollars during this period, you'll see that the Gates Foundation is by far the largest global grant maker as far as grant dollars in our analysis. And you'll see the impact of that later on as we look at different giving by regions or by subjects to see how much that grant making, that amount of grant making can sway the data and make the field look like it has certain preferences, which really are the preferences of the Gates Foundation. But you'll see that there's additional grant makers. Most of those are independent foundations. It's interesting to me, this column about the percentage of funders, how much of their overall work is international. And so with the Gates Foundation, for example, about 87% of all grant making by their institution is global in nature. About 2/3 of the list do almost 50% of their work is international. So everyone except Ford, Packard, the Moore Foundation, and then of course SDCF, although they're a large international grant maker and have climbed on the list up to number 5 in 2015, the majority of SDCF, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation's grant making, is domestic in nature. So only about 17% during the whole time period of their grant making was international, which is what we see with community foundations in their international grant making overall. It's increasing, but it remains a relatively small amount of their overall philanthropy being global in nature. So we were going to launch another poll, and if you look at this list of the top 12 foundations who make global grants during this time period, we're curious, how many of them do you think were established since the year 2000? So do you think none of them? They were all established before the year 2000. A third have been established since 2000, 2/3, or all of them were established after the year 2000. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that, and then we'll keep moving on and looking at more data. Great. So we'll publish the poll. Similar to our first poll, the audience seems really split on whether it is a third since 2000 or 2/3 since the year 2000. It is 1/3 since the year 2000, and so we know that the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Moore Foundation, and the Gates Foundation have all been formed since the year 2000. Great, and so we'll go on to the next slide.
So what we're looking at here is another one of those consistent trends that we see come out of the data. And so international giving tends to be overwhelmingly project focused. 65% of the overall dollars included in the set over these 5 years were for program development. And actually, if you look at the change over time, it also grew in terms of the total dollars from 4.4 billion to 5.3 billion in 2015. And this was in part driven by a handful of very large grants awarded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for global health research projects. And what you're also seeing here is that just 18% was awarded in the form of general support, despite the long-standing debate in our sector around the need for unrestricted funding for nonprofits and the growing body of research to support the benefits of that type of support. And if we look at the next slide, we can see another very persistent trend in international grant making, which is that grants tend to flow through intermediary organizations as opposed to going directly to local organizations. Just 12% of the dollars went directly to organizations located in the country that was benefiting from a given grant, while 88% was channeled through organizations either based in the US or elsewhere that were implementing a program in a different country than where they are based. And just 1% of the total dollars in the set went to local organizations in the form of unrestricted general support. And so to the extent that US foundations do support local organizations, it tends to not be in the form of flexible or long-term funding. But it's really important to note, since we tend to look critically at this trend, it's really important to note that when we're talking about intermediary organizations, we're lumping together a really diverse group of organizations. It can be anywhere from an INGO operating programs in a different country than where they're based, but it can also include things like US public charities that have grant making capacity and are re-granting funds directly to local organizations. And this is a really important group of grant makers that is not included in our research set to avoid double counting grant dollars. But they are also really important proponents for channeling aid directly to local organizations and democratizing our sector. And then there can be anything from organizations that are indigenous to their region but working across multiple countries. It can be multilaterals or global research institutions, which we know are receiving a huge chunk of that Gates grant making. And with that, we can move to the next slide.
Great. So one of the things that we wanted to look at when we were looking at this time period and doing our data analysis is we know there's a lot of concern about what's often called the enabling environment for cross-border giving, and that there are legislation and regulations being passed in certain countries around the world that can make it more difficult for US foundations working globally to make direct grants, building on what Inga was saying of how little in some ways is going direct to local groups. So what we wanted to do was take the countries that were receiving direct giving, so countries where grantees and organizations are receiving funds and then implementing programs within that country, or just receiving them in that country. They could be implementing the programs elsewhere, and to then look at how that compares to what score they might get in an analysis of their regulatory environment to encourage or discourage cross-border giving. And so what we saw was we used the Indiana University Global Philanthropy Environment Index score. So you'll see that in the far column. And it scores countries. This is specifically their cross-border flows score. So it scores them from 0 to 5, looking at how easy it is it to make cross-border grants into and out of these countries. And in some ways, we expected that if countries are receiving more U.S. direct philanthropy, so philanthropy is going to organizations in that country, that it would be easier to make cross-border grants, and so they'd have a higher score. So we were perhaps thinking this list would be much greener than it is, because we sorted the scores based on how easy it is. But you'll see that some of the highest receiving countries, so grants to India, South Africa, Nigeria, are really scoring quite low for their cross-border flow score. And so there isn't the same correlation that we expected to see here. So that lack correlation could mean a lot of different things. It could be reflecting that not enough time has passed since laws were passed that then restrict giving, and so that there's a delay in when we might actually see the impact on dollar flows into certain countries. So a good example of that where we might see a change in the future might be the rank by direct giving of country 11, which is China. This data of both grant making to China and what are the regulations in China for cross-border giving are through 2015. And in China, they passed a new foreign NGO law in 2016, which from initial estimates seems to be impacting how much U.S. philanthropy is flowing directly into Chinese organizations. So we could see drastic changes on this going forward, and there just may not be enough time from when some laws were passed and when this data was collected. It is interesting, as is not necessarily a surprise, that the 3 green countries on this list are in Europe. And if you want to see the full list of this analysis of the enabling environment for different countries and philanthropy in those countries, you can go to the Indiana University website, and that is linked in the full report. So before we go on to the next slide, we're going to start talking about grant making by subject area and population. And so we wanted to do another poll. This is one of the findings that we find really interesting. So which population group from our analysis had the largest decrease in their funding between 2011 and 2015? So there are 4 options: people with HIV/AIDS, migrants and refugees, LGBTQ people, and children and youth. Great, and we'll publish the results, and it seems like we have an audience that has either looked at the report or is very aware of the trends in how U.S. foundations are supporting global programs, because you're absolutely right that the greatest decrease in funding between 2011 and 2015 by population group was for people with HIV/AIDS. And with that, we'll hand it over to the Foundation Center.
Thank you. So yes, very interesting that people picked up that the most significant decrease is to people with HIV/AIDS, and it's down a whopping 81.3% during this time period. And that's despite the World Health Organization saying that there are currently 36.9 million people living with HIV around the world, and even with 1.8 million people having become newly affected in 2017. Obviously, that's a more recent year, but the numbers seem to be generally on track for that. And then the other decrease that I think is worth pointing out, particularly a timely point of interest, is giving to migrants and refugees, which is also down, the only other topic to be down, population to be down actually, by 13.4%. And this is despite the UN High Commissioner for Refugees data showing that 65 million people, roughly the same population of the United Kingdom, are now displaced because of conflict or persecution. And I think we realize that this is a major issue in the time that we live in, and one of the biggest crises that we face. And just to point out, the top 2 population groups receiving the most funding are children and youth and women and girls. And the group receiving the least amount of funding is LGBTQ. However, it's a tiny portion, but it still had an increase over that period of time. And with that, we can go to the next slide. And so now global giving by subject. So for those of you who have read the report, you can see on the screen as well, we've covered quite a few subject areas, and we're just going to point out a couple of other facts that we think are particularly interesting. So I'll start with peace and security, which, although it's received the least funding of the subject areas, it has seen an increase more recently over the most recent 2 years of the report, both more broadly and by the Gates Foundation in terms of dollars. But unfortunately, it's still only a tiny percentage of overall funding and continues to remain small during a time of increased humanitarian needs.
Yeah, and what we can see also from the trends represented in these charts is some of the notable increases and decreases in the set. So health funding continues to increase, and this is where you can really clearly see the effect of Gates, where they are clearly the drivers of the increase. But even if you were to take Gates out of the equation, health funding actually still increased by 20%, slightly slower than the overall growth in international giving, but still continuing to grow. And the same is true for agriculture and food security, as well as economic development, seeing clear increases for those issue areas. One of the most surprising and notable decreases that we saw was education funding. So it remains one of the most funded subjects, totaling $2.8 billion and representing 8% of international giving, but saw by far the sharpest decrease of 31% of the subjects that we were looking at. Science and religion were also decreasing during this time period of 26% and 12% respectively.
Great, and I'll just flag, Inga touched a little bit on what we loosely called, and as we went through this process, the Gates effect, which really can sway which subjects or even geographies, as we'll see as we keep going, seem to be the large priority or preference of U.S. grant makers. But if you actually look at the lines, and that's why it was so important for us in this data, the top line shows the amount of grant making per subject with the Gates Foundation included, and the bottom line shows it for the sector without the Gates Foundation included. So if you look at those bottom lines in each subject area, you actually see that the difference between the top 3 subjects, for example, is not as extreme as it may seem. And so with health, as Inga said, there was an increase over time, ending at about 850 million. Similarly, with the environment, we're at almost 750 million, and with economic development at 670 million for the field. And so the disparity is not as significant as you might think if you just look at the top line numbers of more than 5 billion for health with the Gates Foundation compared to only 860 million for the environment with the Gates Foundation included. And so that also impacts agricultural and food security, and so that's the 4th largest funded subject area, but when we exclude the Gates Foundation, it actually falls down to the 6th most funded subject area for the field overall. And so for us, it was really important to include that distinction of the 2 data sets of including and not including the Gates Foundation.
And then another somewhat surprising trend that we discovered when we dug a little bit deeper into more specific health issue areas was a dramatic increase in the amount of international grant making for reproductive health care. And the period that we're looking at was the years that followed immediately after the reversal of the global gag rule by the Obama administration. And the global gag rule was a federal ban on the use of government funds abroad to fund abortion and related health services. And we knew that there was going to be an increase, which is one of the reasons we looked into this data, but we didn't expect to see this substantial rise in funding. It more than doubled, both in terms of the dollars, but also in terms of the share of overall international giving from 5 to 11%. And one of the reasons we think this is happening is because the risks associated for the organizations that might be receiving private funding for health services that could risk having them lose federal funds. And a lot of organizations that provide these types of services have historically relied on U.S. federal funding. So this was a somewhat surprising finding from the research.
Yeah, if we go to climate change, there's an interesting similarity in the funding for reproductive health and for climate change in that, unlike most subject areas where overall U.S. philanthropy funds more domestically on certain issues than globally, given that 70% of U.S. philanthropy is domestically focused from foundations. For both climate and reproductive health, we see actually more funding for this issue in the international space than in the domestic space. So you'll see that of overall giving to climate change, over 63% was internationally focused. And then overall, that's a very small percentage of overall grant making, right? So it's 1% overall, 2% for global grants. Like with reproductive health, the average international grant size is significantly bigger than the domestic average climate change grant size, and we see that across the board with international grants. Also, interestingly, we wanted to compare climate as a specific focus of grants, but you can also see U.S. philanthropy support globally from foundations for the environment, clean energy, and climate next to each other. Interestingly, in 2012, it appears there's almost $100 million jump in the amount of money for climate, but that really is linked to a $100 million grant from the Hewlett Foundation to create the Climate Works Foundation, which is one of those intermediary, a type of intermediary like the ones that Inga was describing, that then do grant making on behalf of others. And so they're not included as their own foundation because we'd be double counting in the data, but that's really the explanation in the significant increase in 2012, and then we fall back to a pretty consistent level then in 2013 and going through the end. But overall, we still saw an increase in funding for climate change, a small one, about 9.4% throughout the period. But in the big picture, it remains a very, very small focus of the global grant-making activity of U.S. foundations.
Okay, and to wrap up this subject-focused discussion, we're going to look just briefly at funding for disasters. So in addition to the data contained within this report, some of you may know that each year we collect and present data with the Centre for Disaster Philanthropy on a portal called Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy. So definitely take a look at that if you haven't seen that. Essentially, disaster funding over this time period only received 1.1% of total international giving. Excuse me. What we can see from both reports is that philanthropic giving to disasters is usually reactionary and responsive. It's not usually longer term and doesn't include longer term recovery funding. And this is a real issue. We've seen it in peace and security funding, for example. We're seeing it in this broader category of disasters. And essentially, we've focused on the Ebola crisis in this report as an example. So the Ebola crisis in 2014 demonstrates this example, where funding for Ebola increased 154.2 million in 2014 before dramatically decreasing the following year to only 27.2 million. And then just this year in May, a new outbreak of Ebola was identified in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is just really highlights the need to continue to fund these disasters more broadly and taking into account a longer term view. Next slide. So now we're going to look at funding by region, and just for some context to this slide, so global programs receive 53% of the grants. So the grants counted within this slide, the grants allocated to specific regions and not the global grants. And it's worth noting that 64% of the global programs grants are actually by Gates. So as you can see here, Sub-Saharan Africa received the most funds at $9 billion, equal to over a quarter of all funding that went to specific regions at 25.4%. This is followed by Asia and Pacific with 6.6 billion and Latin America with 2.7 billion. The Caribbean received the least amount of funding at 343.4 million, as well as Eastern Europe, Central Asia and Russia with 570.2 million. And you can look at that in more detail in the report. So next slide. And here we shift to funding by country. And you'll see there's two charts on here. One is the geographic focus, which is the location that the grant actually serves. And recipient location is where the actual organization receiving the funds and who will carry out the work is based. And Inga touched on that earlier in the report. So the top 5 countries by geographic focus include India, Israel, Nigeria, China, and Mexico. And the top 5 countries that are home to recipient organisations receiving the funds are the US, Switzerland, the UK, India, and South Africa. And as we mentioned earlier, this is often because grants are going to intermediaries or multilateral organisations, for example, or research institutions located in these countries and are then redistributed. Next slide. And then just while we're looking at the country still, we actually for this report focused on income levels. So this chart shows how funds are being given based on World Bank income categories. The percentages, though, are only looking at data allocatable to specific countries, not global amounts, obviously. So essentially of the total 35.4 billion in international grant dollars from 2011 to 2015, 11.2 billion, or about 32%, could be allocated to a specific country. And as you'll see, I'd say sadly, but actually not that surprisingly, as we've seen this before in trends in other types of funding, that the low-income countries are actually receiving the least amount of funds at 1.9 billion, or 16.7%. And we can go to the next slide.
And so we decided to feature a few of the region deep dives that you can see in the full report, starting with Latin America. And for Latin America, we identified a total of $2.7 billion in funding, and that represented about 7.7% of the total international grant making. But what we're seeing for Latin America as well is a substantial decrease. Funding to Latin America decreased by 32% during this time period. And a few other things to note about funding to Latin America is that the percentage targeted specifically for indigenous populations is much higher, as is environmental program funding, which is about 30% for Latin America, much higher than in other regions. And there's also a slightly higher percentage that goes directly to organizations that are local to the country where the grant is implemented, at 20% compared to the 12% for the overall grant making. We can go to the next region.
Great. So if we look at Asia and the Pacific, that represents about 18% of the overall grant making during this period that's specific to a region. It is dominated by funding by the Gates Foundation. So about 64% of that total grant making to this region is from the Gates Foundation. If you look at the top funders list, they're by far the largest funder by dollar amount. But if you look by number of grants into the region, it's quite comparable with the Ford Foundation, and then you have a number of other funders all making several hundred grants during this period to the region. We do see a little bit less than average of direct grant making to African organizations, at about 16% receiving direct grants. Not surprising, or sorry, to the Asian Pacific region. Not surprisingly, health, given the predominance of the Gates Foundation in the region, is one of the largest subject areas funded by far, and there was an increase in funding for health during the period. We also saw an increase in funding for agriculture and food security. We did see some small decreases for the environment and science, and notably in line with overall trends, we did see a decrease of about 42% for education. Overall, grant making to the region stayed relatively steady with some slight decreases in the end. And if you don't include the Gates Foundation, if you include the Gates Foundation, you saw a general increase throughout the period. So interestingly, peace and security funding more than tripled.
And a quick focus on sub-Saharan Africa. So unlike, in similar vein as the other regions, sub-Saharan Africa received the most funding from Gates Foundation. 72% of all funding actually was from Gates, followed by Buffett and Ford. And as we mentioned, sub-Saharan is the biggest recipient of the US giving. Interestingly, Nigeria is receiving the most funds, and actually double the amount of funds in the next highest country at 1 billion compared to Ethiopia's 459 million. And according to the World Bank, 62% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is below the age of 25. And in this study, we show children and youth as a population group are receiving the most funds, and with a 20% increase. So I think that's an interesting point to take note of. And then although overall funding to HIV/AIDS has gone down, as we pointed out earlier, it did actually increase in sub-Saharan Africa by 19%. We can go to the next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, Lauren, we are going to do our final poll. And so before Lauren talks to us a little bit about the SDGs, we're curious which Sustainable Development Goal attendees think had the least amount of funding by U.S. foundations between 2011 and 2015. So we gave you four options: education, Goal 4, reduce inequalities, Goal 10, life and land, Goal 15, or peace and security, Goal 16. Great. So we were a little bit surprised about this finding as well, especially given the conversation with philanthropy generally about focusing on reducing inequalities led by foundations like the Ford Foundation. But those commitments have actually come past later than this grant period that we looked at. And so looking at this grant period, as Lauren will show us, reducing inequalities is actually the least funded SDG for U.S. foundations.
Okay, thank you. Yes, very interesting point about reduced inequalities. I'm going to come back to that shortly. But so you understand what you're seeing properly on the screen, these two charts show two different types of funding, one being philanthropy and the other being official development assistance, or ODA. So it's important to keep in mind that the numbers are not directly comparable, given ODA is so much higher than philanthropic giving. And for some useful context, just today, the Chronicle Philanthropy stated that although Gates dominates US philanthropic giving to international causes, its total assets of nearly $52 billion are roughly equal to a single year of federal government spending on development and international aid. So I think that's useful for context here. It really is far from a direct comparison. And so what did we find interesting here? Well, SDG 3, good health and well-being, is actually receiving the most dollars from both philanthropy and ODA. And coming back to reduced inequalities, Goal 10, it is actually receiving the least amount of funding from ODA as well as philanthropy. So not just philanthropy that's not focusing on inequalities there. Interestingly, more ODA is going to SDG 4 quality education and less to SDG 5 gender equality, whereas more philanthropy dollars going to SDG 5 gender equality and less to SDG 4 quality education. So it's interesting to see the different focuses for philanthropy versus bilateral and multilateral government spending here. With that, I think we can go back to Natalie.
I just have one more to add here as well before I'll let Natalie take over, which is the finding from the poll is also interesting in the sense that most of you may know that the goals actually didn't go into effect until 2016, but what we're looking at here is the 5-year period before the goals were actually adopted. And so what's the point of us running this analysis retrospectively back in time? What we're hoping to provide with this data is essentially a benchmark to track those kinds of commitments by foundations like Ford and others who are saying, well, we're committing to increasing our funding to reduce inequalities. We'll be able to track that over time, and that's definitely something that we intend to continue to do.
Great. So before we jump into questions, we're going to run one more poll just to get a sense of who's on the line with us. And then we'll be happy to answer questions. So that'll give you some time to think of your question as well. And so what we're hoping to get a sense of is just whether you're representing different types of institutions and why you chose to join us on the webinar today. So are you a grant maker working globally, looking to benchmark with your peers? Are you a grant seeker working globally and planning to use this data for fundraising? Are you a student or academic curious about the sector? Or do you advise foundations or philanthropists on their international grant making? So you want to stay up to speed on current trends. Or are you something else, which as the poll results are starting to come in, we have a good chunk of something else's, which is good to know that we have some real diversity on the line with us. So with that, we'll show you who's on the call with you. Not surprising, given the Council's network and the work at the Foundation Center. We're mostly joined today by grant makers and grant seekers looking to understand the sector trends for their own work, and also some advisors, and then a good chunk of 15% of you are something else. So we have some questions to get us started, and the question box is open for you to submit questions to us, and we'd be happy to take them. So our first question that's come in is, I'll let Lauren and Inga take this one first, is really looking at the SDGs. How do you figure out which SDGs a foundation's grant is supporting? So, and is there something that I could do for my own programs, whether those are be programs as a nonprofit or grants, that you can, so that I can decide which SDGs I'm supporting? What tools are there out there for me as I look at how I relate my grant making and programs to the SDGs?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that question. So the way that we figure out how what grant is allocated to what SDG, the first thing to note there is that both when we're tracking subjects, but also when we're looking at funding by SDGs, we're not thinking about these as categorical. In fact, one program or one grant can support multiple SDGs. So we're always coding grants to all of the relevant subjects and SDGs. And what we have done through a major effort of building a website called sdgfunders.org, which I encourage all of you to check out, is to develop a translation from our own taxonomy that we use to index all the grants in our database to the Sustainable Development Goals, which means all the grants that have already been coded in our database can be translated over to the SDGs, and which is something that happens simultaneously as things get added to our database, so that we can track all of our funding data by the SDGs. And in terms of tools that you can use, I also really encourage you to go to SDG Funders and check out our SDG Indicator Wizard, which is a tool that is designed to help nonprofits and funders really engage with the SDGs and not feel intimidated by the hundreds of indicators listed in large documents. The first thing you can do to get started is really just to drop your program documents, your mission statements into our indicator wizard, and it'll give you back specific SDG targets that match with what you're already doing. But what you can also find on the site is tons of research and reports and articles that are centered around how philanthropy engages in the SDGs. So I encourage you to check out sdgfunders.org.
Yeah, another tool, I'll flag a couple other things. This is Natalie from the Council. The Council and the Foundation Center work together with a couple of other organizations to create an SDG mapping tool, which can be used on the back end of grants management software. And so we've helped a couple of different companies. So if you're a grant maker, one thing to do is to ask your grants management software company if they're able to track your grant making to the SDGs for you. And if they aren't, you can feel free to suggest they connect with us. We have a tool that they can use to do that using the IRS code that they're probably already tracking within their system. And we did that together as partner institutions to really make sure there was some universal tracking of different codes within different platforms and grants management software. So that's one. And then two, the Council's also published 2 reports for foundations and grant makers, just to help you start thinking about ways you can leverage the SDGs in your work. And those are both downloadable on our website. One is specifically focused on community foundations, which was launched earlier this year, and another is for any U.S. foundation working domestically or internationally to think about how these global goals are relevant to your work. And they have lots of case studies of how other foundations have started thinking about the SDGs that might help you, as well as checklists for what you can do to get started. So that was a great question. Another question that has come in is really about this data. And so I'll let Lauren and Inga start this one as well. So is this data available somewhere that I can analyze it in other ways, or are there data tables? Where can I find more about this information behind the report?
Well, you can always contact us with specific questions about individual data points that are featured in this report. We don't make the full grants list available to the public, but we can make them available depending on what your request is. So just reach out directly to us, and we're happy to help you out with any questions that you're interested in looking into in detail.
And if you'd like to explore this data or similar data, grant making data specifically, you can always visit our Foundation Maps portal, which is a great tool for understanding who's funding what where, and you can select these subject categories, for example, specific years that you're interested in, population groups, regions, countries, and the like. So you can set some of your own parameters as to what you're interested in as well. So that's foundationmaps.org.
Great. So another question, which I think some viewers were quite perceptive and picked up on throughout many of the slides, is about the discrepancy in size between domestic grants versus international grants, and how international global grants tend to be significantly larger than domestic grants for the same issue, or just overall the average grant size for global grants being so much bigger than for domestic grants. And it's a question of whether we have any hypotheses about why that might be the case. I certainly hear questions from, I can take this first, from Council on Foundations members. There are a lot of complexities involved with international grant making, and whether you're going through an equivalency determination process or an expenditure responsibility process, if you're making a grant directly to a non-US institution, there's quite a lot of investment that needs to go into certifying that that's for a charitable purpose. And so that often means that certain types of institutions don't want to make grants that are smaller than a certain amount in order to help cover the cost of doing that vetting and different legal processes. And so that can tend to skew the grants to being larger overall than maybe the average grants for domestic causes. And then I would just also flag the Gates effect being a reason for this as well. If you recall, over 80% of the Gates Foundation grant making is global in nature, and their grants overall compared to other funders tend to be bigger, including one of their biggest grants was over $1 billion during this period, and so that can really skew the data as well. Lauren and Inga, other comments or questions on hypotheses for why global grants might be so much bigger than domestic grants?
Yeah, just another thing to note there that I also mentioned briefly earlier is the fact that we don't include grant-making public charities in the data sets besides for community foundations. And like I mentioned, these institutions are the ones that are most likely to award smaller grants directly to local organizations outside the US. And so they're simply not represented in this set. So I think the grant size, there will be more smaller grants in the set, for example, if that group were included. But that's, yeah, more of a hypothesis. I don't think it would cancel out the Gates effect, though, because that is really substantial.
Great. So another question that came in is from a grant seeker asking if we have advice for how different organizations can access U.S. grant makers if they don't already have, quote unquote, a way in. And so how, as a grant seeker, can you access the funding available for international programs? I'm sure we all have different advice. I'm happy to take a first stab at this. I think one of the things that's most important is identifying your universe in order to target the engagement that you're seeking with philanthropy. So knowing, using data like this or the Foundation Maps program that Lauren mentioned, or even SDG funders or other kind of resources about international grant making to really identify who is already working on the issues that your organization works on or in the region that you're working in, so that you're targeting potential partners for philanthropy within philanthropy who are already invested in the issues that you're working on in the regions you work in. I would also say to think about the non-financial benefits of working with philanthropy long term. And so you may be looking for funding, but how can you leverage a longer term partnership or relationship with a foundation and think about them not just in the value that they might have in their grant making, but the values they might have in their technical expertise, their networks, and things like that. Other comments from Lauren and Inga about how you could access some of this funding as a grant seeker?
Another way to think about, I would second what you said about really familiarizing yourself with the funding landscape, and you can use this research. You can certainly use Foundation Maps and other tools that we've developed at Foundation Center and research that Council has done into this. But I would say another way to think about it in looking at those tools and looking at the grant making data is to try to identify what other organizations, what other peers in your geography have been successful in securing funding from U.S. foundations, and sort of trying to exchange some thoughts and ideas with those organizations that are able to attract that funding. We know sort of anecdotally through our work, a lot of it has to do with access to certain international networks. And yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything more.
Add to that, I think there are really great points, and I agree with the most useful tool we think that those seeking funding can use is actually Foundation Directory online. And that's a tool designed specifically for people seeking grants to find information about the different foundations and what they're funding. And you can come into our library anytime and use that in New York City. And I think developing relationships is really key to seeking funding. You need to think of funders as a partner and in the longer term, not just as a bank. And I hope the funders on the phone agree with that.
Great. So with that, we've answered all the questions that have come in, and so thank you very much. It looks like one last question has come in, which is a great question, around realizing that this data is only through 2015, and since then significant things have changed in the world, and a question about what trends we have seen since then, whether that be the rise of populism, the continuing closing civic space, the refugee crisis, et cetera. And have we seen any trends during this period since this data goes to post 2015 that differ widely from these results? So I'm happy to take this as a first, and then I think Lauren and Inga will have more to add. One of the reasons we thought it was really important to do this research through 2015, now that that data is collectible through the IRS 990 forms, is to see it as a baseline for where grant making was at the end of the Obama administration, and then we have comparable data to see what impacts the changes that were flagged in this question might have on international giving. Immediately following the change in administration, there were announcements of new funding for domestic programs by some leading U.S. foundations. It's yet to be seen if that is at the cost of international grant making. Some data released more recently than this around the behavior of individual givers from the Giving USA report does show that in 2017, for the first time in the past few years, we saw a downturn in the amount of funding for international causes. There wasn't a year-on-year growth like we had previously seen in 2016, 2015, and even before that. So that was the first year that we saw just rapid increase in some domestic issues and a decrease in global. So we're not for sure whether that will continue. I think some of the data around the refugees, which we highlighted being a population that got less funding during this period, personally, I haven't seen significant commitments by U.S. foundations to complex humanitarian crises like the refugees, even since this data ended. So we may see small increases in that, but I haven't seen kind of a significant shift in practice where we could expect to see significant changes in that space as one example. And then on the closing space, I think the jury is out, but we are very closely tracking how grant making goes into certain places where it's becoming increasingly difficult as a U.S. funder to work with local organizations, whether that be in China, as I mentioned, or even looking at some of the laws impacting the need to be registered to receive foreign funds in places like India, or anti-money laundering laws that have increased greatly the amount of reporting required for foreign funding by nonprofits in Mexico, et cetera. So over time, we may see a shift away from direct grant making because of those challenging environments in specific countries. At least that is our assumption, and we'll have to see if the data holds true to that. Lauren and Inga, any other comments and things that you've seen changing since this data ends in 2015 to today?
I just second what you were saying, that we want to continue to monitor the trends and really see in the next years of available grants data whether we will actually see a closing in towards more domestic grant making. With the reintroduction of the gag rule, we also want to see if our theories and thoughts around the reproductive health funding is holding true and is directly related to the policies. With the enabling environment, another thing to note is that Indiana University is really continuing to develop their data collection on the enabling environment, introducing more and better triangulated data sources, introducing more countries. And so over time, it'll allow us to explore in further detail that relationship that we were just doing an initial analysis of for this report.
And just a final call to action, this report and any of this research that we do that is so useful for the field wouldn't be available without the data. So we encourage everyone to continue to collect and share their data with us so we can keep producing this work.
Great. And so with that, we do hope that you'll download the full report. It's available on both of our websites. We also will make this recording of the webinar available on both of our websites, and that's a great way to understand the data through different ways of learning, not just reading our report. So we look forward to continuing to be in conversation with many of you about what this data means for the field. And we thank you that we had such great interest in the report in today's webinar. So thanks to you, Lauren and Inga, for being my partners in crime to get this report finished and to talk about the data here today.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks everyone for joining.
Great, thanks. Bye.